They said the forest north of Kvarnheim never ended. Not in the poetic sense, not in the way all forests feel endless to the cold and lost. The old ones meant it literally, that beyond a certain point, distance lost meaning, that the pines grew too close and the air too still, that even the gods forgot the names of things beyond its heart. Eirik had never put stock in those stories, not as a boy, not as a man hardened by raids and frost and the wailing of the dying. Even after the battlefield left him limping and half-deaf in one ear, he didn't fear things with no names. But by the end, he would believe them all. It began with a missing child. Sigrid, 8 winters old, last seen tying up her goat near the tree line past Ingvild's fields. There was no scream, no blood, just a snapped cord and a trail of hoof-like prints in the thawing mud. Not quite deer, not quite anything else. Her mother wept until she choked. Her father, Torbrand, said nothing. He picked up his axe and walked into the forest alone. They found him 3 days later. The corpse was intact, no blood or bite marks, just bones twisted into grotesque shapes, joints dislocated, fingers bent backwards, spine curled unnaturally, as if he'd tried to fold in on himself before death. His eyes were wide open, lips parted, stretched as if caught mid-scream. They left his body untouched. Hrothgar, the blacksmith, said moving it would bring the creature back. That something had claimed him. Eirik didn't argue, but that night, he sharpened his blade and packed his furs. At dawn, he followed the same path Torbrand had taken, into the deep forest. The first day passed without incident. Snow crunched beneath his boots. Pine needles whispered overhead. He passed the burned-out stump of an old shrine by dusk and made camp near a shallow creek. The air carried no scent of rot, no trace of blood, only silence. But that night, something shifted. Eirik awoke before dawn, teeth chattering. His fire had died. Around him, the snow was melted in a perfect circle. Not disturbed, not walked through, just gone. As if something large had stood over him, radiating heat, watching. He did not sleep again. The forest deepened on the second day. Eirik moved at a steady pace, pausing only to leave marks on tree trunks with his sayax. Small slashes, angled and crude. They weren't for direction. They were offerings, or warnings. He didn't say which. The deeper he went, the more the woods closed in. Pines nodded with birch. The air turned thick, as if the space between trees had gained weight. Sound carried strangely. His own footsteps echoed a heartbeat behind. Branches overhead groaned, not with wind, but like something breathing. By mid-morning, he reached a clearing. It was circular, too perfect. At the center stood a structure, not stone, not wood, but something between. Pale and gnarled like petrified antler, fused together in a shape no craftsman could design. Some of it was smooth, some cracked like bone dried too long in the sun. Symbols were carved across its surface, not runes, not anything Norse. The shapes hurt to look at, jagged curves, intersecting lines that seemed to shift if stared at too long. At the base was a bowl, shallow, dry, but stained. Blackish red, not dried blood, too dark. It didn't reflect light, it absorbed it, as if the color itself was alive, still drinking. He left it untouched. The forest led him back to it. He moved west, aiming for higher ground. Hours passed. The sun overhead barely shifted. He counted his steps, marked trees again. By dusk, he was back at the clearing. The same structure, the same bowl. The trees he had slashed bore no wounds. The forest had healed, or pretended. He made camp anyway, and waited. The wind never rose. The fire crackled, but the smoke curled straight upward. There were no stars, only the canopy overhead, dense and unmoving. Then the sounds began. Not birds, not wolves. Voices. Low, muted, like song hummed through ice, a cadence that followed no tongue he knew. They circled his camp, weaving between trunks just outside the firelight. Not close, not far, always moving. He sat motionless beside the flames, sword across his lap, shoulders hunched. Then came the child's voice.
Harit?
Soft and questioning. No fear in it. He turned his head slowly. The voice had come from behind the trees. 10 paces, maybe less. He stood, drew his blade.
"Where are you?"
He said. Silence. Then a footstep in snow. Light. Careful. The fire behind him hissed, not from wind, but from something passing too near. He waited, but nothing came. At dawn, there were footprints. Small, bare, a child's. They circled the camp twice, then ended. No return trail, no drag, just an abrupt stop in the snow, as if the child had been lifted into the air or pulled straight up. He didn't speak that morning, didn't eat. By midday, the shadows stretched longer than they should have. Eirik tracked the sun's position by habit, but it no longer moved in the right arc. The east was still pale. The west was darkening too fast. Then came hoofbeats. Distant, slow, one set. He crouched in the underbrush, hand gripping his sword's hilt. The sound grew louder, closer, then suddenly shifted behind him. He turned, fast. Nothing there, just trees, still and silent. But when he looked up, the sun had changed again. It now hung low in the east, and it was no longer morning. Eirik no longer trusted the sun. It rose twice that day, once in the east, once again overhead. By the time he made camp near a moss-choked ravine, it had dipped low in the north, something that shouldn't happen, even in the high reaches of Norway. He kept his fire small. Whatever was watching him, it didn't fear light. It feared attention. He began carving tally marks into a flat stone by the fire pit, one for each waking. Not each day. Those had become meaningless. He slept when he could, whether the sky was dark or light. On what should have been his fourth day, the forest changed again. The trees weren't just closing in, they were repeating. He passed the same split birch twice, then 3 more times within an hour. On the 5th pass, a crude figure had been left on the trunk, stick thin, antlers drawn in ash or blood. Beneath it, a spiral. Eirik didn't stop. He didn't run either. Whatever made that mark wanted attention. It would not have his. That night, the forest spoke again, but the voices were clearer, no longer distant, no longer just tones. They whispered in broken old Norse, not quite right, like a child mimicking speech they didn't understand.
Eirik, come to the grove. She waits.
He sat by the fire and refused to speak, refused to look toward the trees. He clutched his sword until his hand cramped, then wrapped it again to keep the flesh from blistering. Then came the bell, a single toll, low and deep, like stone struck underwater. It rang once, then silence. He awoke to find his gear moved. Nothing stolen, just rearranged. His blade had been set beside his bedroll, pointing east. His rations had been stacked. A single pine bough had been placed across his boots, broken in the middle. Intentional. Something had stood over him, something that understood him. He stood slowly, head aching, and caught the scent of pine smoke on the wind. Not from his camp, not even from a nearby fire. Older than that, embedded in the trees. He followed it. By midday, he reached the grove. There was no mistaking it. The trees formed a circle, wide and symmetrical, their trunks blackened and leafless. In the center stood a stag. It wasn't alive, or it had ceased to be long ago. Its form was massive, twice the height of a man. Skin stretched tight across bone, pale and brittle. Its eyes were empty. Its ribs moved like bellows, slow and uneven. But it did not breathe. Its antlers bent backward in impossible spirals, each tip carved into runes too old to read. From its hooves, roots spilled outward like veins, digging into the soil, anchoring it in place. Eirik didn't draw his blade, didn't speak. He only stepped forward, and the stag turned its head. The stag didn't move again. It watched. Its head turned only slightly, enough to confirm awareness, not aggression. Its eyes, though hollow, seemed to follow Eirik with a depth that didn't belong to beasts. No flare of instinct, no hunger, just cold, ancient recognition, like it had seen him long before he'd ever been born. He stepped into the grove's edge. The air shifted, not in temperature, in sound. The wind ceased. The forest behind him seemed to vanish, muffled into nothing. There was no birdsong, no cracking branches, just the whisper of blood in his own ears. And a new sound beneath it, a distant hum, not mechanical, not vocal, organic, like tree roots straining underground. At the base of the stag stood a second altar, shorter, broader. Unlike the one he'd passed before, this one pulsed faintly, the same reddish-black stain coating its basin, thicker now, fresh. Eirik circled it slowly, eyes fixed on the altar, not the beast. The runes around its edge shifted when unobserved. Every glance showed a different set, lines and hooks and glyphs that felt sharp, even unspoken. One resembled a bleeding sun, another, an eye without a lid. The third, he didn't look long enough to remember it. He stepped back, and the beast breathed. It was not a living breath. No inhale, no rise of the chest, just the sound of breath, deep and slow, like wind dragged across a hollow mountain. It passed through him, rattled his chest, set the hairs on his arms standing. Then it spoke, not aloud, not in words. It filled his mind like smoke, thick and slow-moving, impossible to expel. Thoughts that weren't his, images instead of syllables. A child walking into the snow. A man, bones twisted into roots. A grove that grew from memory. A whisper. He staggered back, gasping.
Juice.
The images faded, but the taste of them lingered. Copper and soil and something older than either. He reached for his blade but didn't draw. Somewhere in his mind, a voice not his own repeated a name he didn't recognize. Something in the grove wanted something, and it already knew what he would give. He turned to leave, and the grove shifted. The trees were gone. The trail behind him erased. In their place, walls of bark that hadn't been there before, grown inward like a cage. Overhead, branches knotted until they formed a canopy thick enough to block the sky. There was no more outside, only the grove, only the choice. From behind the altar, something rose. Not the stag, another shape, human or close to it, cloaked in black furs, face hidden beneath a mask of bleached antler and teeth. Slender hands outstretched, palms upward, silent, patient. It did not speak, but the message was clear. One life for another, one soul for release. Eirik reached slowly into his tunic, pulled free the token he'd carried since the beginning. A lock of Sigrid's hair, wrapped in linen, tied with a red thread. He held it out. The masked figure did not move. But the air grew colder. and the ground beneath the altar began to bleed. The soil around the altar had begun to darken. From beneath the roots, something seeped. Not blood, not sap. A darker substance, thick, slow-moving, and nearly black. It pooled in the grooves around the stones, steaming faintly in the cold air. The scent rising from it was sharp, metallic, and laced with something ancient. Eirik didn't step back. In his hand, the lock of hair trembled. It wasn't the wind. The grove had gone still again, as if the trees themselves were listening. The figure behind the altar hadn't moved, still cloaked in furs, still masked in antler and bone, still waiting. He stepped forward and lowered the token into the bowl. At first, there was nothing. Then the altar began to pulse. A deep, rhythmic throb that couldn't be heard, only felt, low in the chest, behind the eyes. The stain in the basin began to shift, thickening into a pool that moved on its own. Shapes formed in the liquid. Sigrid, running through snow with her arms outstretched. A goat tied to a post. Torbrand's axe leaning by the door. A soft scrap of cloth clutched in a child's hand. The flicker of firelight across wood. Then the images vanished. The bowl darkened. The heartbeat in the earth grew heavier. The masked figure spoke, not aloud. The voice arrived without sound, pressed directly into Eirik's mind. It circled him, never coming from one place, always just out of reach.
Memory is weight.
It said.
You have carried hers.
A pause, then a question that felt like stone on skin.
Will you carry more?
Eirik's jaw clenched. His grip tightened on the hilt of his blade.
What are you?
A branch cut from the tree.
The voice replied.
A name no longer spoken. Thing that still remembers.
The stag behind the altar exhaled, slow and hollow. The sound stretched outward into the trees. The light shifted. Shadows dragged themselves across the snow, reaching toward the altar's base.
She's not gone,
the voice said.
but she does not belong to you.
The trees around the grove began to move, not bending, growing. Their trunks thickened. Their limbs twisted upward and tangled into one another. Eirik could hear the strain in the wood. The sky above the canopy flickered once, then dimmed, as if clouded by something vast and close. The figure stepped back, its arms lowered. Between them, the ground cracked open, and a second altar rose into view. This one smaller, shaped like horn. No carvings, just a single narrow groove across its surface, worn smooth by use.
You offer love,
The voice said.
but love is not the price.
Eirik didn't respond. He looked down. The knife was already in his hand. He didn't remember drawing it. He walked to the new altar, the blade pressed against his palm. A breath, then pressure, then pain. Warm blood spilled down his fingers and dripped into the groove. It ran cleanly, collecting at the basin's edge. The forest reacted. The breath of the grove deepened. The roots writhed beneath the ground. The antlered stag reared, not violently, but as if straining towards something above it. For a moment, its form split in two, flickering between shapes. Then it snapped back into place with a soundless jolt. Eirik stepped back. His vision swam. Then he heard it. A scream. High. Human. Alive. Sigrid. It wasn't an echo. It was close. He turned toward the sound, heart thundering. The grove was gone. No altar. No blood. No masked figure. No stag. Just snow. And trees. And a trail of small footprints stretching into the dark. Fresh. Leading west. Eirik ran. The footprints led between the trees in an unbroken line. Small, bare, and steady, not the erratic scuffle of someone fleeing. They moved with purpose, as if the child who made them wasn't running from something, but toward it. Eirik followed, boots crunching softly through crusted snow, blood still damp across his palm. The cold bit deeper now, real cold, not the stillness of the grove, but the bite of winter wind threading between the pines. Breath formed clouds again. Snowflakes drifted from above, catching in his beard. Whatever had held the forest in silence was gone, or had stepped aside. He found her near a fallen tree, half covered in frost. Sigrid knelt in the snow, her back to him, staring at something in her hands. Her dress was thin. Her hair clung to her neck in frozen strands, but she wasn't shivering. When he called her name, she didn't answer. Only when he stepped into her footprints did she speak.
I didn't want to follow it.
She whispered.
It looked like my goat.
Eirik knelt slowly beside her. Her fingers were wrapped around a small bundle, twine and driftwood, lashed into the shape of a doll. The same kind she'd carried last spring.
I kept walking,
She said.
even when it got dark, even when the snow stopped making sound.
He placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. She looked at him. Her eyes were the same, but there was something in them now. A silence that hadn't been there before. A depth he didn't like. He carried her back. She didn't speak again. The sun rose as they left the deeper woods. This time it stayed in the sky. The path widened. Birds returned to the branches. By the time they reached the outer farms, the wind had picked up and the snow began to fall again. Soft, natural, unremarkable. Sigrid's mother wept when she saw them. Eirik didn't speak. He handed the child over, watched the woman clutch her close, and nodded once. Then he turned and left before they could ask what happened. He doesn't enter forests anymore, not even for firewood. The antlers still visit him in dreams, not attacking, not beckoning, just watching. Sometimes he wakes with dirt under his nails. Sometimes the trees outside his home shift slightly, even when the wind is still. And every so often, when the snow is heavy and the night long, he finds a mark carved into the nearest pine. A spiral, barely visible, waiting. If this story left you with a lingering chill, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, so you never miss one of Eirik's stories. And tell me, if something ancient offered to trade a life for a memory, would you take the deal? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching Cabin of Whispers. See you next time.